The mark on Dahlia's wrist was burning, not the dull, manageable ache she had learned to ignore over the past 3 months of running, not the whisper of warmth she felt whenever she crossed into a new city and believed, foolishly, that distance might dull what had happened between her and the vampire prince she had fled. This was something else entirely. This was fire, threading through her veins like liquid iron, coiling up her forearm and radiating outward from the strange silver-black sigil that had appeared on her skin the night she had made the worst decision of her life and stood inside Constantin Gravesend's private chambers, uninvited, and touched the ancient binding stone on his desk. She had not meant to activate anything. She had only been trying to steal information, files, photographs, evidence that the Gravesend court was operating a trafficking ring using human runaways. That was what the underground network she worked with had told her. That was why they had gotten her inside the court, disguised as a catering employee. That was the mission, clean and simple. Get in, photograph documents, get out before sunrise. Instead, the stone had recognized something in her blood, something old and inexplicable, and the sigil had blazed to life across her left wrist like a brand. And across the court's marble corridors, every vampire within range had gone completely silent and turned toward the room, and Constantin Gravesend himself had appeared in the doorway, with his white hair loose around his shoulders, his pale eyes wide with something she had never expected to see on the face of a vampire prince. He had looked terrified, not of her. For her, she had run anyway, because running was the only language she trusted. That had been 93 days ago. Now she was in Glasgow, sitting in a rain-soaked alley behind a chip shop at 2 in the morning, pressing her burning wrist against the cold stone wall and telling herself it was fine. It was manageable. She could handle this alone, because she had always handled everything alone, because her mother had died when she was 11, and her father had sold her silence to the wrong people when she was 19, and she had been running from men who wanted things from her that she could not afford to give ever since. The burn intensified. Dahlia Graves bit down on the inside of her cheek and stood up. She had 7 minutes, maybe less, before he found her. She knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat, because the bond worked in both directions, and she could feel him now in that quiet, devastating way. She had been feeling him for 93 days. A presence at the edge of her consciousness like a warm hand pressed against frosted glass. He was close. He had been getting closer for the past week, which meant he had finally stopped waiting for her to come back on her own terms and had started actively hunting her, which was exactly the kind of arrogant, high-handed behavior she had expected from him and had been dreading for reasons she refused to examine too closely. She grabbed her backpack and walked fast toward the street. She made it exactly 4 steps before the alley filled with the particular quality of silence that preceded a vampire's arrival, that absolute stillness where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then Constantin Gravesend stepped out of the shadows at the alley's entrance with his white coat dark with rain and his pale eyes fixed on her with an expression that was equal parts fury and relief and something so raw she had to look away from it. He was, objectively, the most beautiful and most dangerous thing she had ever seen. 6 feet 2, white-skinned with the luminous quality of old marble, white hair that fell past his jaw, and eyes the precise color of silver birch bark in winter light. He moved like a blade through still water, and he wore his authority the way other men wore cologne, unconsciously and with total effect. Every line of him radiated power, the kind that had been honed across centuries rather than built in gyms or boardrooms. She hated how her traitorous heart lifted when she saw him. "Dahlia," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low and precise, carrying the faint traces of Romanian aristocracy that 300 years had not entirely smoothed away and threaded through with something that sounded uncomfortably like concern. "No," she said. He tilted his head. "You have not heard what I intend to say. I don't need to hear it. Turn around, go back to your court, and leave me alone. Whatever the bond thinks it's doing, I didn't consent to it and I'm not honoring it." Constantin was quiet for a moment. The rain came down steadily between them. He did not move from the alley entrance, and she recognized with cold clarity that he was not blocking her physically. He was not positioning himself to prevent her escape. He was simply standing there, In the rain, after 93 days of apparently tracking her across half of Europe, looking at her like she was something he had been afraid he would not find. That was, somehow, worse than if he had tried to grab her. "The bond did not choose you arbitrarily," he said finally. "And I did not come here to claim you, Dahlia. I came because the Binding Stone's activation has been noticed by other courts. The Vâlcu family has sent hunters. Blood law states that an unauthorized bond between a human and a member of the ruling bloodline is grounds for the human's immediate termination unless the prince in question formally claims the bond within the first seasonal cycle." She stared at him. "Seasonal cycle? 3 months," he said. "You have been running for 3 months." The burn on her wrist flared white-hot, and she gasped despite herself, pressing her hand against her sternum. Constantin moved then, fast the way only vampires moved, crossing the distance between them in less than a breath, and he caught her wrist in both hands with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with his speed. "It is accelerating," he said quietly, his pale eyes dropping to the sigil. "Because the bond is incomplete, because you ran before the formal recognition could occur, and now it is trying to complete itself without the ceremony, and it is hurting you." He paused. "It has been hurting you for 3 months. I'm fine." "You are many things," Constantin said, and there was something that might have been dark amusement at the edge of his voice. "But you are not fine." His hands were cool against her skin, and the burning eased fractionally in a way she found infuriating, because it implied that proximity to him was part of the solution, which was exactly the kind of complication she did not need. "I don't know how the bond works," she said carefully, making herself meet his eyes. "I don't know your blood laws or your court politics, and I don't particularly want to. I'm not one of your subjects. I'm a human being who accidentally touched something she shouldn't have, and I have been paying for it ever since. Whatever this is, whatever it means in your world, I am not a prize to be claimed, and I am not going to let my life be decided by ancient vampire law that I never agreed to." Constantin looked at her steadily. "I know," he said, "and I would not ask you to be. But Dahlia, the hunters the Vâlcu Court has sent are not interested in negotiation, and they are not bound by my code of honor. They will find you. They found me before I found you tonight." He paused, and something shifted behind his eyes. "I killed 3 of them in Edinburgh 2 nights ago. There will be more." She absorbed this. "You killed them. They were attempting to locate you using a blood trace left at the last city you were in." "Yes, I killed them." His voice was entirely matter-of-fact. "I will kill everyone they send. But they will keep sending them, Dahlia, until the bond is either formally recognized by the ruling court or severed, and severing it." He stopped. "What does severing it involve?" His jaw tightened. "It requires your death or mine." The alley was very quiet except for the rain. Dahlia looked at the sigil on her wrist, then at the man holding her hand, 3 centuries old, and standing in a Glasgow alley in the middle of the night because hunters were coming for her. And he had decided, apparently without any discussion or her input, that this was not going to happen. She looked at the controlled, careful set of his expression and the deliberate way he was giving her space even now, even when he clearly had the physical capability to simply take her back to his court and solve his political problem by force. He was not doing that. He had come 3 countries to warn her instead. "What is formal recognition?" she asked. Something flickered behind his eyes. Relief, maybe, that she was asking instead of running. "A ceremony before the full court. An ancient vow exchanged before the High Council. It would formalize the bond, give you full court protection under my bloodline's authority, and make any further action by the Vâlcu family a direct act of war against the Gravesend court." He paused. "It does not compel you to anything. You would not be bound to remain at the court. You would not be required to change what you are. It is, in essence, a legal protection. It sounds a lot like a marriage. In some respects," he said carefully, "it is analogous to one." Dahlia pulled her wrist back slowly. He let it go without resistance. She paced 3 steps, turned, paced back. The burning had subsided to a steady warmth, now that he was near, and she hated how much better it felt, how the 3 months of low-graded, constant pain had been so normalized that its absence felt like surfacing from cold water into air. "I need you to tell me the truth about something," she said. "Yes, the information my network sent me in to steal. The trafficking allegations. I need to know if they were true." Constantin was silent for a moment. Not the silence of a man deciding how much to reveal, she thought, but the silence of a man choosing how to explain something complicated without minimizing it. They were planted, he said, by the Vâlcu family. They have been attempting to discredit the Gravesend court for 6 years. The documents your network was given were fabricated, Dahlia. We run no trafficking operation. We have, in fact, been actively working with a small number of human advocates to dismantle the operation that the Vâlcu Court runs. He met her eyes directly. I understand if you do not believe me. I understand that you had every reason to believe what you were told and that you acted with integrity on that information. But it was a lie, and the people who gave it to you were either deceived or working against you. She thought of Marcus, who had recruited her to the network 3 years ago. She thought of the way he had pushed, specifically and persistently, for her to be the one to go into the Gravesend court. She thought of the way, 2 weeks after she fled, she had tried to contact him and found that his number was disconnected and his apartment was empty. Marcus, she said quietly, the Vâlcu Court has deep reach into human shadow networks, Constantin said. They find people who are already running from something. People who move through the world, without firm connections, without family who would notice if they disappeared. People who can be positioned and used. His voice was careful, but his pale eyes were very direct. They put you inside my court, Dahlia. They wanted the bond activated. They wanted leverage against my bloodline. She felt the cold understanding settle through her like ice water. They planned this. The binding stone does not respond to just anyone. There is something in your blood that made you compatible with it. I do not fully understand what it is yet, but yes, I believe they identified this in you and engineered the situation accordingly. He paused. The trap was set for you before you ever knew my name. And for you, she said. Something passed across his face that she could not entirely read. Yes. She stood in the rain and thought about that. Thought about being a piece moved across a board she had not known she was standing on. She had spent years evading men who wanted to control her life, and here she was, caught in the center of a centuries-old blood feud between vampire courts, her body carrying a mark she had not asked for, hunted by killers she had never met. Standing in an alley with the one being in the world who apparently could not simply walk away from her, any more than she could fully walk away from the warmth that eased along the bond when he was near. She was furious. She was also, underneath the fury, something else, something that scared her more than the hunters did. If I go back with you, she said, I make my own choices. I do not become a court decoration. I keep my work and my contacts and my ability to leave if I decide this isn't what I want. Constantin looked at her with that particular quality of attention he gave her that felt like being seen all the way through, clear to the places she kept most carefully hidden. Agreed, he said, without reservation. And you tell me everything, about the bond, about the Vâlcu family, about what formal recognition actually means for both of us. No information withheld for my own protection or to manage my reactions. Complete transparency. Agreed, he said again. And if I find out you've lied to me about any of it, about the trafficking, about the bond, about any of it, I walk and you let me go. He was quiet for just a beat longer than the other answers. Agreed, he said, and his voice was low and serious. Though I would ask, in return, that you give me the same. If you decide this is not what you want, tell me to my face, do not run again. Not because I would stop you, but because... He stopped, looked away briefly in a way that seemed almost involuntary. 93 days of not knowing if you were alive was the longest 3 months of my 3 centuries, Dahlia. I would not repeat it willingly. She looked at him, standing in the rain. 300 years old and regal and dangerous and soaking wet, and she thought that he had probably not said something that honest to another person in a very long time. All right, she said. Let's go. The Gravesend Court's public face in the modern world was a heritage consulting firm operating out of a Georgian townhouse in Edinburgh's New Town, all brass letterheads and antique furniture and human employees, who were paid very well and asked no questions. Its real face was below. Access through a concealed staircase behind a bookshelf that opened on a biometric lock requiring a vampire's specific bioelectric signature, descending 60 feet into what had once been the foundations of a medieval fortification, and had been expanded and refined over 3 centuries into something that existed in the precise territory between fortress and palace. Dahlia had been inside it for approximately 7 minutes the first time, terrified and adrenaline bright, and trying to photograph documents while pretending to carry wine glasses, before the stone had touched her wrist and everything had changed. She had not really seen it then, she saw it now. The main hall was cathedral-ceilinged and lit by hundreds of low candles in iron fixtures alongside modern accent lighting that had been designed to complement rather than overwhelm the ancient stonework. The floors were dark marble veined with silver. The walls were hung with tapestries that were clearly original medieval pieces alongside oil paintings spanning centuries. 3 corridors branched from the main hall, and the whole space breathed with the particular quality of air that moved in places that had been inhabited continuously for a very long time. Standing at the entrance to the left corridor were 2 vampires who looked at Dahlia with expressions ranging from barely concealed wariness to open curiosity. The one on the left was tall and angular, with sharp cheekbones and dark, close-cropped hair, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Dahlia's entire backpack's contents. The one on the right was shorter, more contained, watching her with eyes that were calculating in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of people she had learned to be careful of. "Seraphine," Constantin said to the taller one, "my first blade." "Messiah," to the other, "my chancellor. You will extend the same courtesy to Dahlia Graves that you would extend to any full court member." The calculating one, Messiah, tilted his head with precise formality.
"As you wish, my lord."
"Though the High Council will require a formal presentation before full court status can be." "I am aware of the process," Constantin said pleasantly, and there was something in his pleasantness that made Messiah stop talking. "Seraphine." The first blade looked at Dahlia with open assessment that was somehow less threatening. "You're smaller than I expected," she said. "People often think that," Dahlia said. "I find it useful." Something that might have been approval moved through Seraphine's expression. She stepped aside and gestured down the corridor. Constant placed his hand lightly at the small of Dahlia's back, the touch so brief it might have been imagined, and led her through. The room she was given was not a cage and not a guest suite in the ordinary sense. It was large and high-ceilinged, with a 4-poster bed hung with dark velvet, a fireplace that was already lit, a writing desk, a wardrobe, and, most importantly, a door that locked from the inside and a window that opened onto an internal courtyard, with a clear, unobstructed route to 3 different exits. She noticed this and understood that he had intended her to notice it. The room had been prepared with thought. It had been prepared for someone who needed to know she could leave. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the fire for a long time. Constantin had shown her to the room himself, introduced her to the human staff member who managed the domestic portions of the court with a pleasant efficiency, ensured she had everything she needed, and then paused in the doorway and looked at her with that steady, serious expression. "The presentation before the High Council will need to occur within the next 4 days," he had said, "before the Vâlcu Court can escalate. I will explain the full ceremony tomorrow, when you have slept. There is no pressure tonight." "Constantin," she had said, and he had gone very still. At the sound of his name in her mouth, she had noticed that, stored it away. "Thank you." He had left without saying anything else, and she had heard the particular quality of the silence after his departure, and recognized it as something she would not like to become too accustomed to. She slept for 11 hours, which was more sleep than she had managed in a single stretch in 3 months. The next morning, she explored. She was not going to sit in that room and wait to be informed of things. She moved through the court's lower level with the same methodical attention she brought to every new environment, mapping exits, assessing personnel, noting where the formal spaces were versus the functional ones. The court's inhabitants numbered around 40, a mixture of vampires of varying ages and a small number of human staff, who moved through the space with practiced ease. The human staff, she noted, did not look frightened. They moved freely, made eye contact, spoke normally. One of them, a woman named Bree, who managed the library section, told her cheerfully that she had worked for the court for 9 years and had come via a standard employment posting and had never once been asked to do anything that made her uncomfortable. "Do they know?" Dahlia asked. "Oh, absolutely," Bree said. "That's actually part of the arrangement. Full disclosure, proper compensation, voluntary participation. Mr. Gravesend is very particular about that. She paused. He's particular about most things, to be honest. But human rights is one he takes especially seriously. Dahlia thought about what Constantin had told her in the alley about the Vâlcu Court and the trafficking operation, and found herself filing this piece of evidence carefully alongside his words. She found the document archive on her own. It was not locked, which surprised her until she realized the biometric entry system meant that unauthorized access at the court level was already screened. She spent 2 hours in the archive, pulling everything she could find about the Vâlcu family's activities, cross-referencing with the information she had been given by Marcus's network, and building a picture that made her jaw tighten with steady, building anger. The falsified documents, the planted network contacts, the specific targeting of people with what the Vâlcu records called compatible blood signatures, humans who could activate ancient binding stones, not for love, not for bonds, as weapons, as leverage. As a political mechanism for destabilizing rival courts, she had been a tool in someone else's trap. So had Constantin. She was still sitting at the archive desk, papers spread around her, when a shadow fell across the doorway and she looked up to find Constantin watching her with an expression that was very carefully not triumphant. "You found the archive," he said. "You left it unlocked. I told you. Complete transparency." He moved into the room and looked at the documents she had spread across the desk with the focused attention of a man reviewing familiar material. "You have been thorough. What is the Vâlcu Court's actual endgame?" she asked. "Not just for us. Politically. What do they want?" He settled into the chair across from her, with the unconscious grace of someone who would be sitting in rooms for centuries. Control of the High Council. Currently, the Gravesend Court holds 3 of the 9 council seats. The Vâlcu family holds 2, and they have been working to discredit or eliminate Gravesend-aligned houses for 6 years. If they can force me into a politically compromised position, a scandal involving an unauthorized human bond, a blood law violation, anything that damages my standing with the other houses, they can call for a seat redistribution. And if the bond is recognized formally. What does that give them? Less than they want. A formally recognized bond is lawful under the ancient codes, even an unexpected one. It cannot be used as grounds for censure if the recognition ceremony is completed within the seasonal cycle. He paused. This is why they sent hunters rather than a formal challenge. They wanted you dead before the ceremony could occur. A dead bond partner and an incomplete recognition would have been grounds for a hearing. So the ceremony protects both of us, Dahlia said. Yes, though I want to be clear, Constantin said, his voice very deliberate, that my reason for coming to Glasgow was not the politics. The politics provide a framework. They are not why I spent 3 months tracking you across Europe. Dahlia looked at him. He met her eyes with that characteristic directness that she had learned was simply how he communicated when he was being honest. I came because the bond is real, he said, and because you have been in pain for 3 months and I could feel it, and because, quite apart from ancient vows and blood law and court politics, I have thought about very little except you since the night you ran. The fire in the archive's small hearth crackled. Outside in the corridor, very distant, someone's footsteps crossed and faded. The world continued at a remove, and Dahlia sat with what he had just said, and felt the bond on her wrist pulse with a slow, warm rhythm that matched his proximity. I don't know how to do this, she said quietly. Not this specifically. I don't know how to stay somewhere. I've been moving since I was 19. I know, he said, and I am not asking you to become someone different. I am asking you to give this enough time to find out what it is. She looked at the documents spread across the desk, at the evidence of manipulation, of years of careful engineering by people who had treated her as a variable rather than a person. She thought about the fact that the one being in this situation who had treated her like someone with autonomy and intelligence and the right to make her own choices was the 300-year-old vampire prince who had reason, politically and personally, to simply bring her back to his court and compel compliance. He had not done that, he had explained. He had waited. He had let her read the documents. Tell me about the ceremony, she said. He explained it carefully and completely. The presentation before the High Council, which consisted of 9 councillors representing the 9 major vampire courts, would require both of them to stand before the chamber and speak the ancient vow of recognition, a formal acknowledgement of the bond's existence and a legal declaration of the court's responsibility for the bonded partner's safety and well-being. It was not a love declaration, he was careful to clarify. It was not a marriage in the human sense, though it carried similar legal weight in vampire law. She would not be required to give up her human life, her work, her freedom of movement. She would gain the full protection of the Gravesend bloodline, which in practical terms meant that no other court could touch her without triggering an act of war against one of the oldest and most politically powerful houses in existence. And the bond itself, she asked, what does it actually do to us, physically, emotionally? He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt thoughtful rather than evasive. It creates awareness, he said finally. You can already feel that. Proximity eases it. Distance does not sever it, but it creates a pull. The burn you have been experiencing is the bond trying to complete itself without the ceremony's structure. After the recognition, that pain will stop. He paused. There are deeper aspects that develop over time. Emotional resonance. A degree of shared perception when either partner is in acute distress. The ancient texts describe it as a connection that grows rather than one that is fixed at activation. Have you ever heard of it happening before? Rarely, he said. The binding stone is very old and was created for a specific purpose that has not been relevant for centuries. I was not expecting it to activate. I do not believe it should have been kept in an accessible location. He paused. Mercia has pointed out at some length that this is a failure of court security. Mercia seems like the kind of person who points things out at length. Something that was unmistakably a suppressed smile moved at the corner of Constance's mouth. He is thorough, he said diplomatically. She laughed before she could stop herself and watched the way the sound made him look at her, and filed that away too. The council presentation was 3 days away. In those 3 days, the court operated around Dahlia with a careful normalcy that she slowly stopped anticipating as threatening and began simply inhabiting. She worked. She had her laptop, her contacts, her ongoing investigations into human trafficking networks that she had been running for 2 years, and she continued that work from the archive desk while Bree brought her coffee and occasionally leaned over to look at her research with the bright-eyed interest of someone who had been quietly hoping someone like Dahlia would show up. Constantin came to the archive each evening, not to monitor her work, not to oversee her activity. He came with the specific purpose of telling her whatever he knew that was relevant to what she was investigating, cross-referencing her human network's information with what the Gravesend court had gathered about the Vâlcu trafficking operation from the vampire side. The intelligence merged in ways that were immediately useful. He was, she discovered, exceptionally intelligent and genuinely invested in the dismantling of the operation his rivals were running, not simply because it was politically advantageous, but because the Gravesend court's position on human exploitation was clear, old, and apparently sincere. Your great-great-grandfather wrote the original blood law prohibiting human trafficking, she said on the second night, reading from a text she had found in the deeper archive. In 1743, he did, Constantin said. It was not universally popular, I can imagine. She looked up from the page. Why, at the time, I mean? What was his reason? Constantin considered this for a moment. He believed, he said slowly, that a civilization which treats any category of people as a resource rather than as persons has already begun to destroy itself, that the logic which permits it will always expand. He was thinking of what he had seen in human history, and he concluded that immortality made the corruption worse, not better, that a vampire court which permitted exploitation would become something monstrous over centuries, because they had centuries in which to become it. Dahlia set the book down carefully. He was right. He was, Constantin said. The Vâlcu Court is proof of it. She looked at him across the desk, this ancient, powerful, strange man who had crossed 3 countries in the rain to warn her that hunters were coming, who had killed them when they got too close, who had sat across from her every night for 3 days, and given her every piece of information she asked for without hesitation, and who looked at her sometimes with an expression that was so careful and so controlled that she could see exactly how much effort that control was costing him. "Constantin," she said. He looked up from the document he was reading. "The first night, in your chambers, when the stone activated, you looked terrified." He was very still. "Not of me," she continued. "I said that to myself at the time. You were afraid for me, before you even knew who I was. Why?" He set the document down. "Because the stone's activation in the presence of a human who does not understand what it means, inside a court full of vampires at 2 a.m, could have ended very badly for you," he said. "And because," he started again. "Because when the bond activated, I felt it, I felt you. Not just your presence, but the shape of your life, very briefly and very clearly, the years of running, the loneliness, the intelligence and the will and the terror underneath the composure. And you were standing there, holding the stone, looking like you were absolutely prepared to fight your way out of whatever happened next. And I was." He paused again. "I did not want anything to happen to you." Dahlia's throat was tight. "In 3 seconds, he said quietly, "having never spoken a word to you, I ran," she said. "You did, you were right to, in that moment. You knew nothing about me or what the bond meant, and the rational response to finding yourself in an unexpected situation inside a vampire court was exactly what you did." His voice was very even. "I only wish I had been faster to explain before you reached the exit. You could have caught me," she said. "Before I got out, you're faster than I am." "Yes. You didn't know." He looked at her steadily. "I never will, Dahlia. Not like that. Whatever happens between us, it will not happen, because I removed your ability to choose otherwise." She sat with that for a long moment. The fire in the hearth was burning low, and the archive was very quiet, and the warmth on her wrist pulsed steady and slow, and she thought, with the clarity of someone who had spent years learning to recognize the difference between people who respected her and people who only claimed to, that she believed him. "I want to tell you something," she said, "about why I run." He settled back and waited, without prompting her, without leaning in with urgent or strategic interest. He simply waited. She told him. About her mother dying when she was 11, and the years of bouncing through her father's indifferent care. About the moment at 19 when she discovered that her father had made a deal with the people he owed money to that involved her specifically, that involved using her as a bargaining piece, and the night she had packed a bag in 40 seconds and climbed out a window and had not stopped since. About the work she had fallen into, the investigations into trafficking networks, the way it had felt like the only thing she could do with the life she was living that made it mean something. About Marcus and the network and the slow, sick understanding she had been building since the alley in Glasgow, that she had been placed by people who had identified her and used her, and she had not seen it coming. "I should have seen it," she said. "They were sophisticated and patient, and they had years of practice," Constantin said, "and they specifically targeted someone they knew was already operating without a safety net. Someone who would not be missed in a way that generated investigation." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. They understood that the most capable and self-reliant people are often the most vulnerable to this particular method, because they are accustomed to trusting their own assessment, and they are not accustomed to being targeted with this level of resources. "Are you telling me I was outmaneuvered by an ancient vampire political conspiracy, and I shouldn't beat myself up about it?" "I am saying that you were outmaneuvered by an ancient vampire political conspiracy that I also did not fully predict, despite 3 centuries of navigating ancient vampire politics." He paused. "We were both in the trap, Dahlia. We both find ourselves in an unexpected situation because of it. I would rather find out what we are to each other than spend energy on blame." She looked at him. Something shifted, quiet and fundamental, in the defensive architecture she had spent years constructing, and she felt it go, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the quality of ice releasing at the first genuine warmth of spring. "I would rather find out too," she said. "The night before the council presentation, the hunters came again. There were 5 this time, and they came through the lower utility entrance that Dahlia had catalogued on her first morning, which meant either they had court intelligence or they had better information than the Gravesend security team had accounted for. She was awake when the court's alarm system A sophisticated array of sensors that integrated vampire olfactory perception with modern electronic detection registered the breach, because she did not sleep easily in unfamiliar places, even when those places were warm and furnished with 4-poster beds. She was already dressed when Constantin came through her door, which he knocked on first, which she noticed, and his expression was controlled, but his eyes were sharp with the particular quality she had begun to associate with him, moving from statesman to something older and more dangerous. "Stay with Seraphine," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not hiding while people come after me. Tell me what you need." He looked at her for half a second with an expression that seemed to be rapidly recalculating. "Do you have field experience?" 2 years of investigative work that regularly put me in environments where the people I was investigating would have been very unhappy to find me. "Yes, then stay behind me. Do exactly what I tell you, the instant I tell you, and do not underestimate what the Vâlcu hunters are capable of." "Done," she said. "Let's go." She would think later that the thing that had struck her most about Constantin in those 20 minutes was not the speed, or the controlled violence, or the way he moved through the lower corridors with absolute authority, directing his first blade and the court's defensive guard with precise efficiency. It was the way he kept her in his peripheral vision at every moment. The way he positioned himself without appearing to position himself, so that she always had 2 exits available and he was always between her and the greatest threat. The way. When one of the hunters got past the guard line and she put him down with a combination of her elbow and a fire extinguisher grabbed from the wall mount, Constantin turned in that exact moment, and the look on his face was not exasperation or dismissiveness, but something that was very clearly, unmistakably, pride. The hunters were subdued within 20 minutes. 2 were restrained for questioning. 3 had fled when it became apparent the breach had been anticipated. The court's lower level was undamaged. No one on the Gravesend side was seriously hurt. Dahlia was sitting on a stone bench in the corridor, breathing steadily through the adrenaline come down when Constantin crouched in front of her, silver eyes moving across her with rapid assessment. "You are not hurt," he said, and it was a statement and a question at once. "I'm fine, are you?" "Yes." He stayed crouched in front of her, very close, and the bond on her wrist was singing with warmth. "That was extremely well done, with the fire extinguisher. I have been getting myself out of rooms with whatever's available for years," she said. "It becomes second nature." "I noticed," he said. "I am choosing to find that admirable rather than alarming. Wise decision." He reached out and took her left wrist with both hands, his thumb moving across the sigil with a careful attention that she recognized was not entirely medical assessment. The touch sent warmth moving up her arm in a way that had nothing to do with the bond's activation and everything to do with the fact that she was sitting in a stone corridor at 3 in the morning, with her heart rate still elevated, and he was looking at her like she was the most important thing in the room. "After tomorrow," he said quietly, "they cannot send hunters. It becomes an act of war formally, and the High Council will not permit it. You will be safe." "I know," she said. "Are you frightened?" "Of tomorrow." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think. "Not of the ceremony. I understand what it is. She stopped. "I'm frightened of wanting something I've never had before, of letting myself want it and then having it not work." He was very quiet for a moment. His thumbs moved carefully across her wrist. "I have been frightened of the same thing," he said, "for slightly longer than you have." She looked at him. "How much longer?" Something that was entirely a real smile, the first unconstrained one she had seen from him, moved across his face. "The binding stone," he said, "was on my desk because I had been attempting to understand, for 6 weeks, why it had begun to produce low-level warmth. The text suggested that meant it was in proximity to a compatible human. I had been looking." Dahlia stared at him. "You were already looking for me before I even walked into your court." "I was looking for someone," he said. "I did not know it was you, but yes, the stone knew before either of us did." She started laughing quietly, and after a moment he laughed too, and it echoed in the stone corridor, and it was the most human sound she had heard in the court. And she thought that was probably exactly right. The High Council chamber was beneath the Edinburgh Court, but connected to it through a passage that ran under the Old Town, accessed through a junction point that the 9 major courts maintained jointly. The chamber itself was extraordinary. A circular room with a vaulted ceiling 60 feet high, carved from what appeared to be a single continuous piece of pale stone, and illuminated by light sources that Dahlia could not entirely identify, not candles, not electric. Something that produced a cool, even, bluish-white light that made the whole space look like the interior of a moon. The 9 councillors occupied high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle. Dahlia looked at them as she and Constantin entered, side by side, and tried to read the room with the same instinct that had kept her operational for years. 3 of them looked at her with what appeared to be genuine neutrality. 2 looked at Constantin with expressions she identified as allied. 1 was watching her with open curiosity. The other 3, she noted, were arranged together on the right side of the semicircle and were watching the proceedings with expressions that suggested their presence was courtesy of obligation rather than goodwill. The Vâlcu representative was the one in the center of those 3. He was very old. She could feel that the way you could feel a deep cold, and he was watching her with eyes that she recognized. The eyes of someone who had expected her to be dead by now and was recalculating. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to make clear she was not intimidated, and then she turned her attention to the proceedings. The ceremony was conducted in both the ancient tongue and in contemporary formal language, an accommodation that the Gravesend court had apparently pushed for specifically in the interest of human partners, understanding what they were agreeing to. Dahlia stood beside Constantin before the council and listened to the ancient vow read in both versions, and it was, she thought, extraordinarily honest for something so old. It was a mutual declaration of recognition, protection, and respect. It did not require submission from the human partner. It did not claim ownership. It formalized, in the most binding legal language vampire civilization possessed, that the bond was real, witnessed, and honored. When it was her turn to speak, she spoke clearly and without hesitation. She had made her decision. She was not a woman who did things halfway. When it was Constantin's turn, his voice was very steady and very low, and he did not look at the council. He looked at her. After the final words were spoken, the sigil on her wrist flared brilliant white silver for exactly 3 seconds, and the burn, the constant, relentless burn that had been her companion for 93 days and 3 nights, simply stopped. It became warmth, pure, clean, steady warmth that settled into her skin like sunlight and stayed there. She breathed out. The Vâlcu representative rose from his chair the moment the ceremony concluded. The Vâlcu court formally protests the recognition, he said. On grounds of the recognition is legally complete, said the central councillor, an ancient woman named Theodora, whose white hair was braided with what appeared to be actual silver wire. The seasonal cycle has not elapsed. The ceremony was conducted under full witness. The protest is noted and denied. She looked at the Vâlcu representative with the particular weariness of someone who has watched the same maneuver fail many times across many centuries. Ruslan, sit down. The Vâlcu representative, Ruslan, sat down with the controlled fury of someone maintaining a surface while calculating the next move. Outside the chamber, in the passage that led back toward the Edinburgh court, Constantin stopped walking and turned to face Dahlia, and the expression on his face was very quiet and very open in a way she had not seen before, like something he had been holding carefully for a very long time had been set down. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I can breathe properly for the first time in 3 months, she said honestly. "You?" "Similar," he said, "and considerably more than that." She looked at him and thought about how she had spent so many years moving that she had forgotten, if she had ever really known, what it felt like to stand still in a place that was safe. Not passively safe. Not safe because nothing had found her yet, but actively safe, because someone had placed himself between her and everything that came for her, and had not asked for her gratitude or her compliance in return. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Yes, not about the bond or the politics or the blood law. About you." She held his gaze. "What do you actually want, beyond the court and the council and all the centuries' worth of duty? What does Constantin Gravesend want?" He was quiet for a long moment, not evasive. Thinking honestly, she recognized, the same way she thought, weighing the real answer against the habitual non-answer and choosing deliberately. I want to sit across a desk from someone every evening and exchange information, he said, and find that the information I receive is more interesting than the information I had before. I want to hear someone laugh in a stone corridor at 3 in the morning because the situation is objectively absurd. I want to argue about evidence and be wrong sometimes in ways that I find improve my position. He paused. I want to stop feeling the shape of someone's absence where her presence used to be. Dahlia closed the distance between them and kissed him, which was, she reflected afterward, an extremely uncharacteristic thing for her to do, but which felt in that moment like the only logical conclusion to the sentence he had just spoken. He went very still for the half-second of her approaching, not retreating, just absorbing, and then his hands came up to frame her face with a careful, deliberate tenderness that was entirely characteristic, and he kissed her back with 3 centuries of quiet patience and about 94 days of accumulated relief. When they stepped back from each other, he looked at her with those pale, silver birch eyes, and something in his expression was so open, it was almost painful to look at directly. I spent most of the last 3 months being extremely angry with you, she told him honestly. I know, he said. I also thought about you considerably more than I was comfortable with. I know that too, he said, and the smile that moved across his face was warm and real and entirely unguarded. She took his hand as they walked back down the passage, her fingers laced through his cool ones, and the warmth on her wrist pulsed in a slow, satisfied rhythm that she thought she might, over time, come to regard as simply assumed outside of being home. The weeks after the council recognition moved with a quality she had not experienced before, a sense of forward motion that was not flight. Dahlia continued her work from the Gravesend archive. She expanded it actually because Constantin gave her access to the court's intelligence network, which had decades of documentation on the Vâlcu trafficking operation, and between her human world contacts and his vampire court intelligence, they began building a case that was substantial and detailed and increasingly dangerous to the people it implicated. She moved through the court with increasing ease. Seraphine, the first blade, had taken an interest in teaching her things she described as court survival skills, but which were, in practice, hand-to-hand defense techniques adapted for the specific problem of fighting things that were faster and stronger than you. They trained in the lower hall every other morning, and Dahlia found that Seraphine's sharp manner and complete lack of condescension was exactly the kind of working relationship she found productive. Mercia she was more careful with. He was competent and loyal to Constantin, but he processed the world through political calculation as a first instinct rather than a secondary one, and she could see the way he was assessing the bond's implications for court strategy on an ongoing basis. She did not dislike him for it. It was what he was and what the court needed from him. She simply kept it in view. Bree declared herself Dahlia's person in the way that certain humans adopt other humans, firmly and without particular ceremony, and showed up at the archive desk every morning with coffee and occasionally with research materials she had found independently, which were sometimes unhelpfully adjacent to what Dahlia needed and sometimes remarkably precise. She had, it turned out, a background in investigative journalism that had been what brought her to the Gravesend Court's attention in the first place, and the two of them worked with a productive, comfortable ease that Dahlia found she had not felt with another person in a very long time. Constantin noticed this and said nothing, which was the response she would have wanted if she had thought about it, which she tried not to, because thinking about what she wanted had historically been something she avoided in order to prevent disappointment. She was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain that particular habit. They had dinner together most evenings, which in practice meant she ate, and he sat with a glass of the specific type of blood wine the court produced that apparently met his nutritional requirements without requiring him to hunt, and they talked. She had not known she was someone who could talk to another person for 3 hours without noticing the time passing, but she discovered she was with him, about the investigations, about history, because he had been in it, which she found remarkable in ways that kept revealing new dimensions. About the cases she had worked before the Gravesend Court entered her life. About what she wanted to do with the intelligence they were building on the Vâlcu operation, which was a conversation that grew more operational and more specific with each pass. I want to take it to the human authorities, she said one evening, about a month after the ceremony. Not all of it. The vampire-side material would create more problems than it solved. But there is enough that is strictly in the human domain, organizations, networks, transactions, that could be packaged for law enforcement without requiring them to know anything about who supplied it. Agreed, Constantin said. The court has the same interest. We want the human-side operation dismantled in a way that holds in human law, because that removes the Vâlcu family's resource infrastructure permanently, rather than just creating a temporary setback. And the vampire side? His eyes were very steady. The vampire side is a matter for the High Council, which is why the documentation we have been building on that portion is relevant. I have requested a formal session. You are going to move against the Vâlcu Court, formally. Yes, he said. And I want you to present the human world documentation at the session. As the bonded partner of the Gravesend court, you have standing to address the council. The evidence will be more credible coming from someone with your investigative background than from a court diplomat. She thought about standing in that chamber again, in front of those 9 councillors, with the Vâlcu representative's ancient calculating eyes on her. You know Ruslan is going to try something, she said. Yes, Constantin said. He will not succeed, that's confident. I am 300 years old and I have been navigating vampire court politics since before your country existed, he said pleasantly. Ruslan Vâlcu is 240. He is clever and he is ruthless, but he has made a consistent error in the past 6 years, which is that he has underestimated the Gravesend court's actual capabilities because he has focused his analysis on our public profile rather than our private resources. He paused. He has also now made the very specific error of attempting to harm you. I take that extremely personally. She looked at him. There was something very quiet and very certain in his expression that she found, in spite of everything, deeply reassuring. The High Council session was 6 weeks after the recognition ceremony, and it was nothing like the quiet formal proceedings of that earlier meeting. The chamber was full, all 9 courts represented at full delegation, and the atmosphere was the specific quality of tension that preceded a significant political shift. The kind of charged stillness where everyone in the room knew that what happened in the next few hours would determine the shape of things for decades. Dahlia stood and presented the human world documentation with the methodical precision of someone who had been doing investigative work for years and knew exactly how to construct a case for an audience. She had anticipated the objections Ruslan would raise, and she addressed them preemptively, laying the evidence in sequence so that each piece built on the last in a way that was impossible to dismiss without dismissing the entire foundation of the argument. She spoke for 45 minutes, and she did not waver, and she did not soften anything. When she was done, the chamber was very quiet. Theodora, the central councillor with the silver-braided hair, looked at the Vâlcu delegation for a long moment. Ruslan, she said, the council will hear your response. What followed was 2 hours of procedural argument that Dahlia followed with close attention from her seat beside Constantin. She could feel the bond's warmth steady throughout, and she was aware of the way Constantin, seated with perfect stillness and the composed authority of someone who had sat in rooms like this for centuries, would occasionally glance at her with a small, precise look that said he was tracking her reaction and that he was, quietly, proud. At the end of those 2 hours, the council voted. 7 of the 9 seats voted to formally censure the Vâlcu Court, strip 2 of their allied houses of council standing pending investigation, and refer the matter of the trafficking operation to the joint vampire-human liaison body that, it emerged, had existed quietly for 40 years as a mechanism for exactly these kinds of interworld jurisdictional problems. The Vâlcu delegation departed the chamber with the contained, rigid composure of people who had lost significantly and were not yet finished calculating what came next. Ruslan paused beside Dahlia on his way out. She stood and let him pause, meeting his eyes directly. He was very old and very cold, and she could feel the age radiating from him the way you could feel the cold from deep stone. You are very capable for a human, he said. Thank you, she said pleasantly. It will not last, he said. You're welcome to come back and check your prediction in a few years, she said. I'll be here. His eyes moved to the sigil on her wrist, visible below her sleeve, and something that might have been reassessment moved through his ancient gaze. Then he left. Constantin was beside her a breath later, his hand at her back, his voice low. That was either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily reckless. Probably both, she said. Is he actually going to be a problem? He will try, Constantin said. But the council censure removes most of his direct capability, and the human side operation being referred for prosecution will take considerable resources to manage. He will be occupied for years. He paused. And he is now very aware that the Gravesend court is not the isolated political entity he believed it to be. Because of me, because of us, he said, with the quiet weight of a man who meant exactly what he said. The Edinburgh spring came in sideways, as Scottish springs did, with rain and unexpected warmth alternating in patterns that felt entirely contrary to logic. Dahlia's room in the court had become, over the months, genuinely hers in the way that no space had been hers since she was 10 years old. Her books were in the shelves, her work was on the desk. The door still locked from the inside, and she still noted exits by habit. But the habit had become comfortable rather than urgent, the background precaution of a careful person, rather than the active survival mechanism of someone who was always preparing to run. She had called Bree into the archive on the morning after the council session and told her that the case was ready to pass to the human law enforcement contacts she had cultivated, the specific detectives and prosecutors who handled organized crime cases that were unusually complex, and who had learned over years not to ask Dahlia too precisely how she came by her information. "You're sure you want to send it now?" Bree had asked. "Given everything with the council session yesterday." "Especially given the council session," Dahlia had said. "The vampire side action and the human side prosecution should move simultaneously. If the Vâlcu family sees the human authorities moving on the network infrastructure, it reduces their ability to focus resources on obstructing the council proceedings." Bree had looked at her with the expression of someone watching a particularly elegant piece of architecture go up. "You know," she had said, "when I interviewed for this job 9 years ago, Mr. Gravesend told me that the court's long-term project was building a sustainable ethical position in the modern world. I think you might be the actual mechanism of that." Dahlia had thought about what to say to that for a moment. "Someone needed to be," she had said finally. "I'm glad it's me." That evening, Constantin found her on the internal courtyard bench, where she sometimes sat when she needed air and the outside world was inconveniently daylit. It was past 9, and the Edinburgh sky was holding on to the last of the dark blue that preceded full night. And he came and sat beside her with the ease of a man who had learned over months where she would be, and had stopped feeling that knowledge required justification. They sat for a while without speaking. She had found that she could do this with him, sit in comfortable quiet, which was something she had not been able to do with another person in a very long time, because silence with other people had always carried the texture of performance anxiety, the question of whether she was being sufficiently present or sufficiently entertaining or sufficiently whatever the situation required. With him, quiet was simply quiet. "Marcus," she said eventually, "I found out what happened to him." Constantin was still. He did not know, she said, what the Vâlcu family's actual plan was. He thought the information about the trafficking operation was real. He was deceived the same way I was. When he found out after I ran that it had been fabricated, he tried to investigate and they made him disappear. She paused. "He is alive. The joint liaison body found him in a safe house in Lyon, where a Vâlcu-connected network had been keeping him contained. He has been released." She looked at her hands. "He spent 3 months trying to get me a message and couldn't reach me because I was running." Constantin reached over and took her hand without ceremony. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Better than all right, actually. I thought I had misjudged him, and I was angry about that. I'm glad I was wrong." She laced her fingers through his. "He wants to come and meet me, here, if that is something that can be arranged." "Of course," Constantin said. "Any person you want here is welcome." She looked at him. "You know that is a lot of trust to extend." "You have given me a great deal of trust," he said simply. "Returning it seems like the minimum viable response." She laughed, and he smiled. And the Edinburgh night settled around them in that specific way of Northern European spring, where the air was cold and the sky was enormous, and the world felt, briefly, like it had space in it for things to be good. She turned to face him on the bench. He was watching her with those pale, quiet eyes, and the bond on her wrist was warm and steady as heartbeat. "I have something to tell you," she said. "Yes, I stopped thinking of this as temporary," she said. "I'm not sure when, somewhere between the council session and tonight, but I'm not here because of the bond's legal protections, or because the hunters are stopped, or because the work has become too useful to abandon. I'm here because I want to be here, specifically. This court, this city, these people." She met his eyes. "You." Constantin was very still in the way he went still when something mattered enough that the ordinary social automatic responses stopped, and there was only the real thing underneath. "Dahlia," he said. "I know what I am saying," she said. "I've thought about it clearly. I'm not running from anything. I'm choosing something. That is, as it happens, a first for me, and I would appreciate you not making it unnecessarily complicated." He reached out and touched her face with one hand. With the same careful deliberateness she had come to understand, was his version of being completely unguarded, and looked at her with 3 centuries of quiet depth and about 5 months of something newer and more specific and more his own. "I love you," he said. Not as an announcement, not as a strategy, as a fact he had apparently decided to simply say out loud. She felt the bond on her wrist flare warm, and then settle to something deep and constant, and she leaned into his hand and said, "I know. I love you too. That is also a first." He kissed her with the Edinburgh spring air around them, and the ancient court beneath them, and the whole complicated, dangerous, improbable shape of their situation, and she thought that she had spent years believing that wanting things only made you vulnerable to losing them, and that this had been true as long as she was choosing what to want on other people's terms. She had chosen this one herself, in the months that followed. The human-side prosecution moved forward with the efficiency that came from years of careful groundwork and a prosecutorial team that had been waiting for exactly this quality of documentation. Four major trafficking networks with Vâlcu connections were dismantled across 6 countries. The human authorities did not know the full shape of what they were unraveling, and that was, for now, appropriate. The joint vampire-human liaison body provided careful guidance without visibility, and Dahlia served as the human-side coordinator, which meant she was extremely busy and also exactly where she wanted to be. Marcus came to Edinburgh. He was quiet and clearly still shaken by his 3 months of containment, but he was fundamentally the same person he had been, thorough and principled and deeply uncomfortable about the role he had played, however, unwittingly in the situation. He spent 2 days at the court, and Constantin received him with formal courtesy and human practicality, which Dahlia thought was exactly right. Marcus left with clearer purpose and cleaner information than he had arrived with, and his network became, carefully and gradually, a resource the joint liaison body could work through without revealing more than was wise. Seraphine taught Dahlia 3 more defensive techniques and told her, in the direct manner that was simply how Seraphine communicated, that she was more useful to the court than most of the vampires in it, which Dahlia received as the significant compliment it was intended to be. Messiah recalibrated, as she had expected he eventually would. The court's position after the council session was stronger than it had been in decades, and the role that the bond and Dahlia's investigative work had played in achieving that was, from a political calculation standpoint, irrefutable. He would never be warm, she thought, but warmth was not what she needed from him. What she needed was what she eventually got, which was a working professional respect that made the court function better and made both their lives easier. Bree introduced her to 3 other human court members she had not yet met properly, all of whom had come to the Gravesend court through different routes and had stayed for similar reasons: the clarity of the arrangement, the honesty of the code, the particular quality of life that came from being in a place where you were valued for what you actually were rather than what someone needed you to be. Dahlia stood in the archive one afternoon in June. Sunlight coming through the courtyard windows in the upper portion of the space, her case files spread in their organized pattern across the desk, Bree's coffee cooling at her elbow, and felt something she could only describe as the absence of dread. The low-grade constant companion she had not even fully registered as dread until it was gone. The part of her brain that had been scanning for exits and updating escape routes, and holding the energy of the next departure already partially planned for years without rest. It was not gone because the world had become safe. The world was not safe, and she would not pretend otherwise. It was gone because she had stopped holding herself in the posture of someone about to flee. She had put down the weight she had been carrying. For so long she had mistaken it for herself. Constantin appeared in the archive doorway at 6:30 with 2 glasses of the particularly good wine Theodora had sent from the High Council's private collection as a gesture of post-session goodwill, and he set one beside Dahlia's work, and then leaned against the desk, and waited for her to look up. She looked up. He was wearing the slightly less formal version of his usual impeccable coat, because they were not meeting anyone official tonight, and his white hair was slightly disordered from the wind that came through the lower passages in the evenings, and he was looking at her with that warm, specific, completely undisguised expression that still, 5 months on, made her breath catch a little. "Long day?" he asked. "Good day," she said. "We have the Lion Network documentation ready to pass. I want to send it this week. I expected nothing less." He tilted his head at the wine. "Drink before you move on to the Lion Network documentation." She picked up the glass. He raised his. "What are we drinking to?" she asked. He considered. "To first choices," he said, made without a trap underneath them. She felt the warmth on her wrist pulse, steady and full. "To first choices," she agreed. Outside, Edinburgh moved through its ordinary evening, with no idea what lived beneath it, and inside the archive of the Gravesend Court. The human investigator and the vampire prince sat setting us in the warm light with 3 centuries of history and approximately 5 months of something new and entirely their own, and the bond between them settled into its permanent shape, which was not a chain and not a cage and not a complication. It was simply the shape of 2 people who had found each other through a trap they had both escaped, and who had decided, independently and then together, that what they had found was worth staying for. Dahlia Graves, who had spent years perfecting the art of leaving, stayed, not because she had to, not because the blood law required it or the bond compelled it or the hunters had closed off every other exit. She stayed because, for the first time in her life, staying was the choice she made with her whole self, freely with open eyes, in a place where she was entirely known and entirely wanted. It was, she thought, a very long time coming, and it was, she thought, worth every single mile of the road that had led her here. Constantin reached across the desk and took her hand, and the bond burned warm and constant between them. And outside, the Edinburgh night came in full and dark and beautiful, and the ancient court breathed around them with the particular sound of something that had waited a very long time for exactly this moment, and was now quietly and completely at peace.